Peace and welcome to the One Black Perch Publishing Channel, a space where we share books on writing, editing, publishing, creativity, and cover some trending topics in book publishing news, as well as updates on our projects. Because both writing and reading skills are declining nationally and there's all this noise around AI, it can feel like reading to get better at writing might quickly become a fringe interest until we no longer value originality, authentic depth behind our words. Peeling through pages of books on the craft of writing will continue to serve storytellers and poets more than tinkering with a series of zeros and ones. At least that's my view of it. But this is Writing Tools, 55 Essential Strategies for Every Writer by Peter Clark. I finally got around to reading it after having it for a while, how he grouped the types of tools that he walks through, and the explanations of the tools are so simple. The author, Roy Peters, he's a scholar at Poynter Institute, taught writing for 30 years to school children and Pulitzer Prize winners. He's written 18 books, written or edited 18 books, including this one, How to Write Short and The Glamour of Grammar. He organized the book into 4 parts, the nuts and bolts. So the strategies for making meaning at the word, sentence, or paragraph level. Then there are special effects or the tools for economy, clarity, originality, persuasion, blueprints, or the ways of organizing and building stories and reports. And then useful habits, which is routines for living a life of productive writing. So because there's programs like Grammarly, the Hemingway app, Pro Writing Aid, Scrivener, and a bunch of others, when I read books on writing now, I tend to gravitate toward writing advice that helps with the bigger picture strategic thinking, like artistic intent, and the habits that help execute, especially since those programs are already pretty strong in some of the finer details of writing. Plus putting my attention on more of the strategic bird's eye view helps me avoid getting caught up in the details of word choice or word order, because there's a separate time for that. And with new writers, there's not often word or line advice that they need help with the most. It's usually planning, whether through outline or statement, mission or goal, or simply asking critical questions before beginning can save you days or even months of your time, which I'm sure you would agree your time is precious. I'll go over a couple of tools from the blueprints and useful habits section that should help if you have a book idea that you've been putting off and you're not sure how to approach it, or like where to start or how to start. But if you're stuck in a certain phase and you could use like an outside word to sort of pry you out to finish, it's a great book. And in the introduction, he gives a couple of suggestions for using the book that probably applies to most books on writing you'll run into, honestly. First being, remember that these are tools and not rules. And the second is, don't try to apply all these tools at once. And when you see just how much creative flexibility some of these writing tools can afford you, you'll immediately want to begin experimenting and then mixing your experiments together. It's kind of hard not to, and you should, but over time, you don't want to put any unnecessary pressure on yourself. Improving anything is challenging enough, and even if you enjoy what it is you're doing and care about, and you care about it, you don't want to burn yourself out. I see a conversation every now and then about whether a writer is a pantser or a planner. A pantser is someone who can sit down and complete a draft from beginning to end without any organized framework. Planner is just what it sounds like. These people are pretty organized. I say these people because I'm not one of them. Scenes are outlined. Prominent beats in the story are marked. Critical dialogue is sort of loosely conceived, and of course the ending is figured out along with the beginning scenes of their sequel. Like they already got it all figured out. But even in the case of a pantser, there's a vision developing as you write, an ability to see the character's fates play out along numerous paths in front of you as you sort of walk through them, and choose as you go, knowing ultimately where you may end up or where you will end up if you already chosen what your ending is. There might not be some explicit instructions, but it's not as random as it can sound. That's why whether you aspire to be a planner or not, it's good to know how to strategize your writing and then execute them in steps. The first suggestion in Clark's blueprint section, of course, is to use outlines. In nearly any composition class, you're going to outline. Even though they're helpful, a lot of students and writers, they just don't enjoy them. He said he got stuck so often that he just got frustrated. He just started making reverse outlines once he completed his first draft. He said if he couldn't organize a piece of writing into a coherent outline, it meant that he had a hard time telling the parts from the whole, or maybe lack clarity or coherence or something like that. So the reverse outline is kind of like an audit for organization and flow of your writing. I've grown to like writing from a plan because if your attention is split, drafting multiple things, you can easily jump in and start where you left off with. Occasionally, I'll fill in sections of writing. It's out of order sometimes, because I know that they're sectioned off. It's really easy to rearrange or place something somewhere else later on if I want to. You wouldn't be able to do that with the reverse outline because there aren't any predetermined sections yet. But it really shouldn't bother the writer so much to work with the plan. When you think about it, both fiction and nonfiction are usually separated by chapters, parts, and sections. And when you think about it scaled out, they're separated by volumes, series, and sagas. So while you might visualize your story as a chronological story from beginning to end, there's still opportunity to create well-placed breaks for the reader within the story. Not just in fiction and nonfiction. In poetry, you'll sometimes come across sections or chapters. Sometimes it's a story arc or some other sequence or grouping that's intended for the reader to experience in a certain way. Another suggestion he makes is to build your work around a key question. Great questions drive great writing, and that's why it's important to form critical questions that drive your book to answer them. All of your little side plots, your side stories about supporting characters, all of those, they have their little engines and questions that they need to answer too. So that's part of what keeps your reader engaged while you're taking them through the answer to the larger overarching question of the story. Fiction has its engines that form as key questions too. It makes the questions and makes thematic elements out of them. An example he gives is about Macbeth's engine. It's ruthless ambition leading to destruction, or Othello's, which is jealousy destroys itself and the object of his love. So those are converted into themes by flipping the key question around. Like case of Othello will his jealousy destroy him and the woman he loves? It'll become specific to the story. Drive keeps interest, and a story lacking drive feels like it's lagging. Actually might just lack key questions that make the reader curious enough to stay with you. But going back to the point about planning, ask yourself, what are the things that your story is about? You might have an outline or a series of events that happen in the story, but what do they reveal about people? What does it remind us about ourselves? Does it warn us about the things within us? Does it celebrate them? If you haven't thought about those questions or others like it, or universally connected questions, then less likely you are to have the sort of gravity that your story needs to make it mean more than the sum of its events. If you have a topic or period in your life that you're writing about, memoir or poetry about your life, these same kind of questions still apply, and you should definitely engage them. What are you revealing, showing the reader in your work? What might your work invite them to explore about themselves? Maybe the poems are how you work through the questions. Flexible pieces of writing advice that he gives is to write toward an ending. There's the bigger picture, the broader view of your story, and having at least a loosely developed idea for how your book ends. But aside from that, he claims that you will write better endings if you remember that parts of your story need endings too. So obviously you aren't agonizing over the end of every sentence as you're drafting, but sentences have endings too. So do conversations, chapters, scenes. Keep in mind that your first job is to keep the reader's attention. So each sentence, paragraph, and dialogue includes little cliffhangers and foreshadows. And Clark calls this placing gold points along the way. The idea is that the reader deserves rewards for staying with you through all those cliffhangers and foreshadows, waiting for the payoff from the larger story, so they get these gold coins and answers to the mini engine or the mini drivers of your story. One of the ways that Clark suggests for endings is called closing the circle. This is really common in movies where the opening scene is also one of the final scenes, or certain conversations from the beginning are referenced at the end. A lot of movie genres use that, and it's just as useful and effective in a lot of book genres too. Even if we expect a return to the opening scene or something prominent within the story, how it happens and what's said once you're there, once it's encountered again, is what matters more anyway. And that's what the reader's anticipating. What they remember most about, your story is how you did it. Aside with a final scene or series of scenes takes place, saves a ton of mental energy too. It gives you sort of like a corner piece to the puzzle. Whatever leads up to it and connects directly to it has to blend well and make sense in the big picture. And just like your goals, you have to plan from the end. Know where you want to get and work backwards. Word count goals, story goals. Another popular ending is an apt quote, or when a character sort of distills what has come before, what's happened in a brief statement. Sometimes the character is the best vehicle for it, but most of the time it's the narrator, according to him. One of the exercises he suggests for testing an effective ending is to put your hand over the last paragraph in your draft and ask, what if your story ended a paragraph before that last ending? What about 2 paragraphs back? How far can you go go back and still produce effective closure. If you're prone to overwriting or redundancy, this can help you see that less is more. Then there's the epilogue, which is where we see life after the end of the story. So with either a new environment to establish new normals or as a return to a familiar environment with new consciousness. The movies where the audience is asked to care about many characters, you'll see the movie wrap up scene after scene, showing you what each character is doing in the aftermath of stories. And romantic comedies, horror movies, all of them use it. Some movies would feature the final scene after the credits roll, and that became pretty common for a while too. So it's sort of the same thing. That's the way I would think of it. After the credits of your story have rolled, you give a sneak peek into the aftermath. There you have your closing scene. One that I find myself thinking about pretty often is mobilize the reader. He says a good ending can point the reader in another direction. So attend this meeting, read that book, send an email to your senator. So clear, actionable instructions. The example he gives sounds like they're referring to or nonfiction, academic, or political work, but is there a way that you can spark an imperative in readers through your fiction or through your poetry? What do mobilizing stories have in common? Maybe that's a question to ask. Another way to close I see myself leaning into is, sort of exploring your options with a sense of playfulness. Is called the tieback, which is sort of similar to closing the circle because you're ending with a reference to an object or element from earlier in the story. Where they differ though is that the tieback refers to an odd or offbeat, obscure object or element instead of something more prominent like an opening scene or some other easily accessible reference. Repetition is also a writing tool that's effective for training readers to remember things, but it also heightens the reader's radar for other repetition. So tying in an obscure object or a place at the very end of your story will make the reader want to go back and read the scenes or scenes where that thing shows up with a bit more attention than the first time they read it. This is one of the ways that writing can contribute to our critical thinking, our memory, as well as our language skills. So no negatives there. Clark has some advice about writing habits that are on my short list of keepers. The first one that he mentioned is writing a mission statement for your work. He means for you to do this for your writing as well as for a body of work and for each story you write. He calls this writing about writing, and I've heard psychologists and Buddhists warn about too much inward looking. He says that by writing the mission statement, we turn vague hopes into language, and that by writing about writing, you learn what you need to learn. So for a fiction magazine, he published a 29-part short story series over a month, and some of them were, I want to portray my protagonist as a fully human character and not some cardboard saint. I want to write each chapter with a standalone quality. I want a cliffhanger ending. I want people to identify with and care about the protagonist and her family. So your goals can include a mix of perspectives and aspects to set goals around. If you're turning your hopes into language, then it wouldn't hurt to list your motivations for telling a particular story or revisit why you tell stories. Are there certain ideas that you want to highlight and amplify in your writing? Is there a way that I believe a reader can be made better by reading your story? The opportunity that making a mission statement creates is that it can narrow your focus, making it easier because you have sort of lanes or constraints to work with. The next exercise at the end of the chapter tells you to study more of some of your old pieces of writing, some of your favorite or best ones, and write a mission statement for each of them. Similar approach to reverse outline. Another suggestion is read for form and content. I hope that as you improve your writing, that you're reading about the topics that you write about and that you read the forms that you also write. Like poets who don't read poetry or fiction writers who don't read fiction. For instance, if you're writing about your childhood, then you might want to look at highly recommended childhood memoirs and biographies, personal accounts that read like either a private conversation or a side-by-side witnessing. So reading a few titles can help you refine how you want to approach yours. Or even if it's a fiction book, reading real stories about childhood will help because the content matches even if the form doesn't. Even if the topic or content is different, you're taking in rhythm and syntax. You need to construct poems as you read them if you're a poet. So the content matters less, even though you do want to fully appreciate what you're reading. So for the sake of learning and producing new work that also sort of surprises you, you want to be able to take advantage of using your brain as the creative cook that it is and trust your gut to process the ingredients. So one suggestion he makes is to save string. This is one of my favorite suggestions. So just think about those huge balls of twine or rubber bands. Like the research for your work, it grows one piece at a time, and you have to seek the pieces out and put them there. And he uses a file box that looks like a milk crate, but you can use the storage on your computer and the free storage in whatever email you use, phone, external drive, whatever you have, cloud service. You have a folder in my email called scraps. Each file in it is called scraps and then the date. So after determining the topic that you're researching, you can put it all in one folder. There's featured stories on prominent blogs, recently published research in academic journals and magazines, memes, tweets, TikTok videos, all of that. You just dump it all in, all your string into that box. Here you're doing this for something that you haven't started yet, is that you can do this across numerous topics and use your self-awareness to set your limits, because you don't want to get overwhelmed by having too many boxes. But in terms of method, he says, save string, gather piles of research, be attentive when it's time to write, and write earlier than you think you can. And then let those early drafts drive you to the additional research or organization that you need. It's common for fiction writers to read about random towns and cities to help them describe walking through neighborhoods. So even if you're a fiction writer, there's value in conducting real world research and observing everything and taking everything in, and not needing energy to imagine what kind of streets and sidewalks you're setting readers on. I can't believe it took me so long to get to this book. It was on my list to read back in March of last year, I believe, but it's cool. We back though, helping people who care about writing. At least until Neuralink and one of those LLM chatbots can create an entire collection of literature from our thoughts. Hope you got something out of this video. If you didn't and you waited this long, man, I'm sorry. But if you did get something helpful, hit like and subscribe and be notified when new videos are uploaded. Thanks for watching. Peace.